Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our last seminar in our seminar series at the Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. I am Maral Sahib Jami, a postdoc in the center, and I have the honor of introducing our final speaker for the semester. Alexander Jabbari is an assistant professor of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Minnesota, where he works on the literature, history, and philology of the Middle East and South Asia. His first book, The Making of Persianate Modernity, on the screen, Language and Literary History Between Iran and India, was published with Cambridge University Press in 2023. He has also published numerous articles in journals such as Iranian Studies, Journal of Persianate Studies, PMLA, Philological Encounters, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and elsewhere. Please join me in welcoming Professor Alexander Jabbari.
Thank you so much, Maral, for that introduction. Can you all hear me okay? Great. And thank you all for being here in the middle of the week. I want to thank, in absentia, Behruz for inviting me, and Allison and others involved in putting this together. So thanks very much. I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak with you today about my book. I'm going to speak, I think, probably closer to 40 than 45 minutes, and then I understand we'll have time for discussion afterwards, which I look forward to. So just to begin broadly, the book is about intellectual and literary exchange between Iranians and Indians in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I show how they drew on Persianate networks in order to modernize their shared heritage. But in doing so, they helped consolidate nationalism and produced a kind of Persianate modernity which erased the traces of their cosmopolitan cooperation. So one of the larger arguments that I make here is for the continued salience of the Persianate framework into the modern period. We don't assume that the Persianate as a conceptual framework is arranged the same way or means the same thing in the 9th century as we do in the 15th. So why not think of the 19th and even 20th centuries as a differently arranged or understand the Persianate framework as differently arranged in these time periods rather than as ceasing to be relevant. So let me say a little bit about the Persianate, which of course is Marshall Hodgson's coinage in 1975, but really in the last 10 years, a little more, has taken off. Persianate studies has kind of come into its own as a field of study onto itself. This is just a few of the recent monographs, the flagship journal, conference, and so on. But okay, what is the Persianate? From about the 9th to the 19th centuries, although I'm going to push on that chronology, Persian had been a cosmopolitan lingua franca, a common language of learning and statecraft across much of the Eastern Islamic world, or what we can call, following Hodgson, the Persianate world. This is a kind of maybe minimalist map of the extent, and a more maximalist one would have to include more beyond these particular empires of the Caucasus, of Central Asia, extending, as recent scholarship has shown, even as far east as Siberia, even as far south, beyond the Mughal Empire, further into the Deccan and southern India, and even into at the greatest expanse, the Malay world, Zanzibar on the eastern coast of Africa, and elsewhere. So throughout this widespread geography, the Persian language had served to link together different peoples and societies through shared texts, common aesthetic, social, and political forms. In other words, adab, what Manakia has translated as proper form, although I prefer to think of it in terms of convention, which is something I'll come back to in a little bit. Now, I don't want to romanticize this past. This is a world that is deeply stratified by often very rigid hierarchies of things like age, gender, social class, and social status. But it's cosmopolitan specifically in the sense that something like modern concepts of ethnicity or being a native speaker of Persian did not form the basis of such hierarchies. Indeed, something like ethnicity is not really one of the operative concepts in the period that we study when we talk about the Persianate world, and something like the idea of a mother tongue or a native speaker is a late 19th century innovation. It comes quite late to this. And so instead of then privileging someone that in modern terms we might think of as a native speaker of Persian, what was much more salient, what mattered more, was having a Persian education. Rather than whether or not you spoke Persian at home, for example. So accordingly, there was no geographic core or center to this Persianate world. Somewhere like Iran is not necessarily central, and indeed, you could argue, I might argue, that the center of gravity is in the Mughal courts of India, which with their wealth were able to outpace other parts of this geography, including Iran, just in sheer volume of Persian literary production. Now, to move forward a little bit in time, in the 19th and 20th centuries, encounters with European colonialism precipitated deep social and political change in Persianate lands like Iran and India, and of course elsewhere. So staggering losses of power and sovereignty and territory to European empires provoked deep soul-searching among Muslim intellectuals. They came to believe that something like tradition had to be consolidated and reformed in order to survive the conditions of modernity, but that also that tradition offered resources for developing a modern approach to the world. And so this kind of conservative reformism informed much of the development of national and communal cultures in Iran and India. So Iranian and Indian reformers then shared both a pre-modern Persianate literary tradition and a modern experience of colonial subjugation. Obviously not the same conditions in Iran and India, but really dealing with some of the same questions. Part of this story this provided this shared background and shared experience provided the basis for a shared Indo-Iranian project of modernization. And part of that story, of that shared modernization project, has been told over the last couple decades of critical scholarship on Iranian nationalism, which really highlighted the role of India, and in particular of Parsis, or Indian Zoroastrians, in the making of Iranian nationalism and modernity. So again, just a few of the works that I have in mind here in that wave of scholarship, which sought to challenge nationalist historiography by showing how Iranian nationalism really took shape beyond the borders of the nation state and significantly in exchange with actors who were not Iranian citizens or living within Iran and so on. And so this was a kind of wave of revisionist historiography that at the same time, by focusing on Zoroastrians in particular who claimed a genealogical tie to Iran, this scholarship overlooked the role, the important role, I argue, of Indian Muslims in this same project. These Indian Muslims were just as much invested in the Persianate heritage, and they did play a role in this sort of modernization and development of nationalism, including in Iran itself. So Muslim intellectuals, Iranian, Indian, intellectuals and their texts and ideas circulated between modern Iran and India. And this was enabled by the enduring cosmopolitan networks of Persianate exchange. Urdu-speaking intellectuals were typically literate in Persian, at this time period at least, and they're keenly attuned to developments that are going on in Iran, and key texts are translated from Persian into Urdu, but also the reverse, from Urdu into Persian. And the transmission of knowledge between the two languages is not just textual, and not just about print, about translation of one work being published, and you can clearly identify, here's the translator, and these are the this is the setting in which it was translated, and so on. Ideas are also traveling orally, following Iranians and Indians who are traveling in much greater numbers now between the two countries as they come to be aided by new technologies, the steamship, physical infrastructure like drivable roads that are now linking the two countries. They're sharing space with one another in shrines, in seminaries. They're working and socializing in the same circles. And so these multilingual travelers then acted as vernacular translators. This is a kind of transmission of ideas that doesn't always leave the same kind of print trail, but they can spread ideas that they've learned during these international encounters to interlocutors back home and kind of orally translate between texts that they've read or people that they've encountered, new ideas, and so on. And we can see this, one way that we can see this anyway, is to reconstruct some of, as I did, the social circles of key figures, like, for example, the 20th century Iranian statesman and literary scholar and poet Mohammad Taqi Bahar, who wrote exclusively in Persian. He knew Arabic and some French, but didn't know Urdu. But he didn't need to know Urdu to be aware of and understand developments that are going on in the world of Urdu letters, because he has a circle around him who does. And so this includes Indian Muslim literateurs, Abdul Hamid Irfani, Adib Peshawari, Muhammad Ishaq, the literary historian, politicians like Ghazanfar Ali Khan, as well as Iranians like Fakhr Dayi Girani and Dayul Islam Esfahani, who had spent extensive time in India, knew Urdu very fluently, were prolific translators from Urdu into Persian. And so again, without directly reading Urdu, Bahar can still and does learn about ideas that are being developed in that language through his social circle. We can do the same if we put an Indian Muslim at the center here and try to reconstruct their social circles, as I did, for example, with the Urdu poet Noon Mim Rashid, who was a cultural worker in Iran. He was pressed into service in the British Indian Army during World War II, which occupied Iran. And during his time there, he worked at Radio Tehran. And he sent letters home to his wife. And so reading his unpublished letters, I was again able to reconstruct his social world and to see that he's deeply, intimately connected with luminaries of the Iranian literary and intellectual scene, people like Fatemeh Sayyah, the kind of founder of the discipline of comparative literature in Iran, Ali Asghar Hekmat, the Minister of Culture, Isa Sadiq, the Minister of Education, Iran's most prominent poets and translators, and so on. So again, here's somebody who can act as a vernacular translator. He spoke Persian and Urdu very well, and can let his Iranian interlocutors know what's going on in the world of Urdu letters, of which he was a central part. Now, I've focused here on literary figures and these kind of literary intellectuals for a reason, and that is because the world of literary exchange, and in particular the composition of literary history, was a key site for developing a modern approach to tradition, a way to manage the contradictions between these old texts that come to be revered as national heritage, tradition, and new values that the modernizers held. And so as a new genre of writing then, Persian literary history starts to emerge out of exchange between Iranians and Indians, between figures like Mohammad Taqi Bahar, about whom I've just spoken, this key Iranian literary scholar, and Indian Muslims like Shibli Nomani writing in Urdu. And this is all kind of emerging in the second half of the 19th century, first half of the 20th century. So intellectuals in both countries drew on the same Persian literary tradition and on each other's works in seeking local models for modern writing. So the emergence of literary history then as a genre of writing becomes central to modernization and the consolidation of national and communal identities. Modern literary historians shared with one another their medieval sources. They drew on, for example, Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, coming to read it in a new way as a source of modern historiographical values. They relied heavily on tazkires and indeed on the same tazkires as one another, these kind of traditional biographical dictionaries of poets. And all of the modern literary historians drew especially on one tazkirah in particular, which is Reza Qoli Khan Hidayat's Assembly of the Eloquent, Majma' al-Fusaha, which is often called the sort of last Persian tazkirah. So they all use this text, they cite it, they engage with it, they mine it for information. And yet they all agree with one another that it's full of inaccuracies and distortions and errors, and they all complain about its deficiencies. So why then did it become such a ubiquitous source? One of the reasons is its comprehensiveness. It's a tazkirah that covers everything rather than one of the more specific tazkirahs that limit themselves to the poets of a particular court or a particular era, or so on. And so in that comprehensiveness, it's ripe for appropriation for modern literary history with its universal scope. But I argue even more importantly than its comprehensiveness, it's useful because of its problems, not in spite of them. Working through the text's many errors and contradictions was a kind of productive exercise that served for later scholars as an invitation to comment and correct, kind of like the way poets respond to one another through forms like istiqbal and jawab. In the same way, modernizing literary scholars found in Assembly of the Eloquent an entry point where they could insert themselves into a conversation by correcting Hidayat's mistakes without writing his work off altogether. Now, another contradiction this modern use of pre-modern sources posed was that the tazkirahs, these anthologies, have a kind of dictionary or encyclopedia format. They treat each poet in a separately bounded entry. But modernizers are seeking to offer a linear story of national progress through the history of language and literature and the development of Persian poetry. So while the tazkirahs remain their major sources of information, they come to structure their modern literary histories with a new sense of linear, progressive time. And this makes it possible to treat all of Persian literature, including material in pre-Islamic languages, like that we would now call Old Persian, Middle Persian, to treat all of this as a single and continuous whole. And this kind of narrativization was also, again, a collaborative endeavor. Shibli's Urdu language, poetry of the Persians, was really one of the first texts to pioneer this model of modern literary history, introducing Orientalist philology, knowledge of these pre-Islamic languages, introducing a linear sense of time and modern historiographic methodology to the sort of traditional tazkirah format. And this text will go on to influence Iranian literateurs like Bahar, as well as European Orientalists like Edward Browne, among others. But I guess influence is really the wrong word to use here, because in this book I'm arguing against the simplistic model of influence, the kind of received wisdom or often taken for granted idea that Persian influences Urdu. Urdu doesn't influence Persian. Here's my really sophisticated model. I hope you guys can follow this. But how I'm conceiving instead of the relationship, at least in the 19th and 20th centuries, between them. And Shibli's Poetry of the Persians is a text that really challenges that sort of hierarchical model. Maybe Arabic is at the top, and then Persian, and then Urdu, and influence kind of goes in one direction. Here's an Urdu text that is extremely influential for many Iranians and also Afghans who are writing in Persian. And at the same time, it's not just about flipping the directionality and saying, okay, now Urdu is on top or something, because these are texts that are really being written in tandem, in conversation with one another. They're serialized. They're coming out volume by volume. So Shibli publishes a first volume of his work in Urdu. Edward Browne is reading this. He's writing in English. He's citing Shibli. He publishes a volume of his literary history of Persia. And Shibli reads that and responds. And meanwhile, Bahar is reading Browne. And this is much more of a dialogue that's kind of unfolding over time. More or less simultaneously across Persian, Urdu, and English. Now, one of the most difficult contradictions that modernizers faced in, again, reconciling pre-modern materials with modern attitudes arose with regard to the homoerotic and sometimes very explicit poetry that made up much of the classical Persian canon. Beloved poetic masters like Rumi and Sadi wrote poems celebrating the love of male youths in frank, unabashed language. And the Tazkiras, which anthologized this poetry, were very open about sexuality, sometimes, downright gossipy about the lives of poets and their homoerotic sexual exploits. And they were very comfortable with genres like hazl or satiric poetry, which could be extremely vulgar, could have, be full of invective and very coarse language and very graphic. And so this openness around sexuality and even vulgarity, as well as the celebration of homoerotic desire, were all part of the conventions of pre-modern Persianate writing, in particular genres, right? Not in all poetic genres, but more especially in the ghazal, for example, and in particular prose genres, like the Tazkira being one of them. And so again, I don't want to overstate this, that there's this entirely different sexual regime that changes, but rather it's the conventions around representing and writing about love and desire that change, and they do change very dramatically in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Indian Muslim reformers, influenced by a kind of ersatz Victorianism that's been exported to the colonies, including British India, come to value chastity and to disparage homoeroticism. So, for example, in his book, Poetry of the Persians, Shibli Nomani describes how, in his view, human nature dictates that men desire women. And he states that Persian literature, which is, quote, the highest and most subtle in the world, is laid to waste through the absurdity of the depiction of male-male desire, and in particular, amrad parasti, or worshipping handsome male youths. And Shibli expresses bashfulness and reluctance to even mention the subject. But he continues, he states, it's the author's religious duty, farz, to explain the causes of this practice. And he pathologizes the practice. He treats it as a disease, in his words, maraz, to be diagnosed and then treated. So to be clear, it's nothing especially new for a Sharia-minded scholar like Shibli to disparage homoerotic practices that are normatively prohibited in Islamic law. What is new here is two things. One is his medical language, pathologizing the practice. It's consonant with developments at the same time going on in Arab Islamic world and Arab Islamic thought. But more importantly, it's Shibli's reticence, it's his reluctance to even discuss the subject. He repeatedly reiterates his discomfort with discussing homoerotic matters. He says, for example, the details of Sadi's Amrad Parasti, worshipping handsome male youths, he says, it cannot even be mentioned. And this itself is very novel. Sadi, in the Golistan, says his contemporaries would consider it a weakness, ajz, if he doesn't discuss the topic. So it's not something you cannot discuss, it's something you must discuss. And the scholars in the Hanafi juridical tradition that Shibli admires and models himself after, from as early as Sarakhsi in the 11th century to somebody like Ibn Abidin, who's just like a generation or two, actually one generation before Shibli, dies in 1842. All of these Hanafi Sunni Islamic scholars are totally comfortable in discussing these matters of sexual intercourse and homoeroticism in their work. So again, to be clear, they discuss it as illicit, but they don't mince words about it or couch their discussion in apologies. They get to the point and discuss it like any other matter of fiqh or jurisprudence. So this new bashfulness, again, a conventional bashfulness around sexuality, especially homoeroticism, comes to be shared by Iranians as well. And I don't have as much time to get into this, but I'm happy to say more in the Q&A about why I identify this with somebody like Shibli as conventional and not simply a deep-seated personal belief or something like that. But the shared convention around this, we see this just as much among the Iranians, who again are not living under the same regime of colonial censorship that a 19th century Indian Muslim is, and yet nevertheless share exactly the same language and conventions for discussing these matters. It's a story of these Indo-Iranian connections. It's about, Bahar, for example, gives a remarkably similar account of the origins of homoeroticism to the account that Shibli gives. And so overall, they share these incredibly consistent kind of Puritan conventions when dealing with racy poetry. So they share the conventions, even if lived experience can be something different. So this exchange, this cosmopolitan, perhaps, exchange between Iranians and Indians produces not very cosmopolitan, Puritan literary histories. And perhaps an even greater irony of this exchange is that it helps to consolidate a nationalist logic that comes to associate the Persian language and literature almost exclusively with Iran. During the 19th century in India, the British move away from patronizing Persian towards languages that they come to deem as local, vernacular, like Urdu. And meanwhile in Iran, nationalists transform Persian into a language of national identity, and they kind of rhetorically position Iran as the proprietor to the Persianate tradition. Literary history is a key genre for articulating these new communal and national identities and for presenting Persian as Islamic heritage in India, as Iranian national heritage in Iran. Yet Iran took center stage even in Indian accounts of Persian literature, despite India's historic role as a center for Persian literary production. Even as Urdu became, as I argue, a vehicle for continuing the Persianate tradition in India, Indian Muslims did not challenge the nationalist logic linking Persian to Iran. Instead, many actively embraced this narrative, even tying their own linguistic identity to Iran and elsewhere in the Middle East. And in so doing, they wound up writing themselves out of the history of Persian literature and ultimately out of belonging to India. Now, given the convergence, as I've shown, in Iranians and Indian Muslims' narratives of Persian literature, it's striking that their conceptions of the Persian and Urdu languages differ very radically. And so, I mean, the narratives that they construct around what is this language, what is its history, what does it come from, or where does it come from, rather, these are like mirror opposites I don't think that's an image that works, mirror opposites. But anyway, they're radically different. They're totally different across these two languages. Now, the actual historical circumstances that historically gave Persian and Urdu their respective identities as distinct languages and literary traditions are again actually very similar. The Persian language, in the form that we know it today, is really born out of and shaped by its interaction with Arabic and with Islam. So the elements that give New Persian its identity as a distinct language, distinct from, say, the language of the Sasanian court, what we'd now call Middle Persian. All of these are things, these elements that give it that distinct identity are all things that have to do with Arabic. It's a new script, it's a new set of vocabulary, literary forms, meters, imagery that are borrowed from or developed in conversation with Arabic, even a name that reflects the limits of Arabic phonology. So this role of Arabic in giving Persian a new linguistic and literary identity is very similar to the role that Persian then goes on to play in the subcontinent for a language that will later come to be called and known as Urdu. And so this North Indian idiom takes on a new identity by borrowing from Persian its script, again, vocabulary, literary forms, new name, and so on. So very similar actual historical dynamics shaping the rise of these languages as literary vehicles. Yet, modern Iranians and Indians made very different meaning of these historical dynamics. Iranian nationalists conceived of the Persian language in opposition to Arabic. 19th century Orientalist philology and knowledge of pre-Islamic languages gave them a civilizational paradigm. Persian as part of Indo-European family of languages, as distinct from a Semitic family of languages like Arabic. And so this therefore offers a narrative of continuity over time and across diachronic, stages of language from, what will come to be called Old and then Middle Persian and then New Persian. So all the way from, the Achaemenid period to the modern day. And to be clear, I'm not disputing the linguistic or historical accuracy of this model, far from it. But what I want to highlight is that adopting historical linguistics as a national narrative is not something to be taken for granted. It's actually extremely contingent. And we can see that by looking comparatively at the narratives that develop around Urdu, Indian narratives around Urdu. So contrary to this Iranian narrative of continuity over time and sort of, indigeneity, that, Persian exists and Arabic and Islam kind of comes somewhere in the middle but doesn't fully interrupt a kind of ongoing continued chain. In contrast to this, South Asian Muslims start to see rupture and hybridity as key to the story of Urdu's origins. So according to this telling, Urdu begins with the arrival of Islam in the Indian subcontinent. And rather than conceiving of their language in terms of distinction from others, many Muslims embraced hybridity, regarding Urdu as inherently a melange of different linguistic elements, Persian, Arabic, sometimes Sanskrit is thrown into the mix, sometimes Turkish is thrown into the mix. This narrative is still very popular today. So Iranian nationalism could align itself with the new Indo-European philology, but Indian Muslims could not do so because the British had situated Hindi and the Hindus as heirs to this kind of, as heirs to Sanskrit and heirs to this kind of enduring civilization. And they had positioned Urdu speakers, Urdu-speaking Muslims as foreigners, as outsiders to India, connected to other geographies. And of course, that's a narrative that is an incredibly pernicious one that's being weaponized, even as we speak today in India. Now, another consequence of these different narratives around language is very different developments in print culture. In fact, we can see, before I move on to that, we can see an illustration of these kind of popular narratives around language. I mean, just really, just to illustrate the point. This is not my methodology in coming up with it. But quick Google image search, history of Urdu language. Everything is in a particular script. It's in Nastaliq, about which I'll say more in a moment. You see a lot of 19th century lithographs. And then history of the Persian language, you see a number of scripts, really a number of languages or stages of the language represented. So there's a popular imaginary about what constitutes Persian that encompasses this number of scripts and stages, which is very different from the sort of what Ross King called the vernacular belief system of Urdu speakers, how they think about or tend to think about the language. So Nastaliq then had historically been a script hand of choice for both Persian and Urdu. But Iranians readily adopted movable type in Naskh, which you see on the left, when the technology emerged, became available. But Urdu speakers resisted that shift and stuck with Nastaliq, as you can see in this lithograph on the right, which meant that they continued using lithography, which allowed for the reproduction of handwritten Nastaliq in ways that were just not possible or not elegant to do with movable type. And so Urdu continues using lithography for this reason all the way up until the 1980s, which is when you start to get digital fonts that can reproduce Nastaliq. And Urdu, of course, continues to largely be written in Nastaliq today, whereas Persian is now almost always written in Naskh. And this is because, in part at least, because of how the Arabic script in a particular hand, in the Nastaliq hand, became a constitutive element of Urdu's identity as a language. It's still often cited as the most defining difference between Urdu and Hindi, and it's often used in Urdu as a synecdoche for the Arabic script itself. So people say, writing in Nastaliq, and what they mean is any kind of writing that's in the Arabic script. So while so this is the case for Urdu, where part of what makes Urdu is this particular script, whereas Iranians have, as we've seen, a narrative of Persian as a language with a continuous history that across multiple scripts. And this leads to a fascinating phenomenon in Iran, which is that from the end of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th, there's this explosion of proposals for script reform in Iran, and very, very few comparable such proposals in South Asia for Urdu. So we'll quickly take a look at a few of these. Am I doing okay on time? Yes. Okay, great. So there were, this is one of the sort of best known examples developed by an Iranian, Mirza Fatali Akhundzadeh, for writing Persian. And you can see, some of you may already be able to, if you squint just right, you can make it out. Here's the basmala. Actually, it's more full. We have Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And so the principle here is taking the Arabic script and then modifying it, not abandoning it altogether, but that each letter will be written separately and will be written one way. There's a sort of similar principle, kind of alphabetic principle at work here in Mirza Malkam Khan's late 19th century proposal for reforming the script. This one is easier to figure out. Anyone familiar with Persian literature, you might actually recognize the text if you can read it. We have again the basmala at the top. So this is the dibache, the beginning of the dibache of Sa'di's Golistan, Minnat Khudaya Azza wa Jal. And so you can see, again, the principle is to turn the Arabic script into something alphabetic, and there's a really pseudo-scientific idea about here that the script is holding back literacy, and that alphabetization will be key to sort of modernization. Now, these two examples are the best known ones, and have been discussed. But really, there were more than 50 of these proposals. Some of them really out there that are really not known. This is Mirza Ali Mohammad Khan Ovaisi's new script, Khat No. He was an Iranian consular in Istanbul, and so he develops this kind of space age-y script. Again, following these same principles, letters should be written one way, consistently, separate from one another. And you can see here, Khat No, and so the kasre ezafe is also represented in the script. Khat No, akharin islah khat farsi ist. Again, it's not totally also reworking things completely from scratch, but others do come up with something even more radically different. Just one example, Muhammad Akbar Khan Yusufi is an Afghan who comes up with this script that is meant to be able to reproduce Persian, Arabic, also Pashto. He comes up with this in the 1910s, 1920s. And there's an Armenian community in Kabul at the time, and I think it's my speculation that this is influenced by the form and shape of the Armenian alphabet. But again, even though he comes up with these radically new letters, the same alphabetic principle, he even goes further in writing from left to right. And so again, there's this pseudo-scientific idea. Does writing from left to right or right to left really matter in terms of literacy? No. But there's an idea that emulating, in a way, culturally or aesthetically even, the sort of Western languages is key to unlocking literacy. So again, these are just a few. I won't have time to go into all of these, but as I said, there's more than 50 of these proposals for new scripts just from the end of the 19th century until 1950. So on the one hand, this is part of a larger global trend of script change in the Islamic world, which continues in the 20th century. You can think about Latinization in places like Somalia and Indonesia, or the adoption of the Cyrillic script in the Soviet sphere. And across these different settings, the pseudoscientific idea that Arabic script is holding back literacy. But there's also something going on here that's specific to the kind of story of Persianate modernity, which is that while there were some proposals to adopt the Latin script, for example, for Urdu, they really don't find traction. They're quickly abandoned. I have not seen any of these kind of unique scripts that would be proposed for Urdu. There's far less interest in script reform among Muslim South Asians than among Iranians. And again, it's partly because it's the Arabic script that is, believed to give Urdu its distinct identity. Whereas there's a desire from the Iranian nationalists. Of course, none of these script proposals ultimately win out, but I think it's remarkable that there's so many of them. The idea that of this kind of radical distinctiveness to Persian, and that the script should reflect that. So it's not only about the idea of being scientific and modern, but also of being unique. And much more I could say about this, and about these possibilities of punctuation, which I didn't talk about, that are latent in the manuscript tradition and find very different articulation in print. But so more I could say, but I'm going to move to conclude. In this book, I tried to weave together literary and historical methodologies to draw from literary comparison as well as connected history. as I've demonstrated, hopefully, it's this kind of comparative history of modern Persian and Urdu that reveals contingencies at every step of the way in developments like different national or communal narratives, or even in the aesthetics of script. But of course, this is not just a comparative history, it's also a connected one. It's a story of interaction and cooperation between Iranians and South Asians, between people working in Persian and in Urdu. And so I'll conclude then by reminding us that what appears today as national culture, as unique and discreetly bounded and sui generis, is a product of exchange with others from beyond the borders of the nation state. This is certainly true in Iran and in Muslim South Asia. Nationalism and what I call Persianate modernity is the veneer that hides the conditions of cooperation and exchange that had generated national culture in the first place. As I said, there's a lot more to the story. I was only able to talk about a little bit, but I'll stop there. I'm happy to say more in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jabbari. That was a wonderful talk. I've looked through the book and definitely read many parts of it, but I look forward to going back now with this presentation and looking at it again. Are there questions from the audience? All right, we'll start here.
Hi, thank you so much. So I wondered when, first of all, this was really exciting for me. I will say I learned a lot. I'm really excited to read the whole book. The question I have was, in fact, in reading the title, but it remains with me even after the presentation, which is if I think through my understanding of Manakiya's work, which in my reading about the Persianate, I think is a unique interpretation of the Persianate as, and this is my words, not hers, as a kind of insurgent site of non-modernity, as in of pre-modernity, where it may linger into the present, I mean, or later, maybe perhaps into the 19th century, but that it is radically at odds with the modern. This was my reading, so maybe I was wrong there. And I mean, one could perhaps say that there is a certain nostalgia with which, Mana writes about this kind of lost world. So if I was to think out of that understanding of the Persianate, it is not possible for the Persianate to be consistent with modernity. And that perhaps is what is the intervention you're making. But then I suppose what is, so if, and one, I guess one part of the Manakiya argument that I saw playing out actually in this work is what happens to the Indian Muslim, and perhaps even the Indian Hindu who wrote and spoke and participated in the Persianate before modernity, is the fact that there is no longer a place for them in the Persianate. And that's precisely what it made possible. So, and I bet, I'm sure you have an answer. It's just a question that stayed with me. Can there be a Persianate modernity in the meaning of Persianate as it has at least developed in Manakiya? So.
Well, I think you can predict what my answer will be. It's yes, but it's a great question. Thank you. I'll start with the second part of this. What you mentioned, the things that kind of fall through the cracks. And I borrow. I should mention. I borrow this term Persianate modernity from Mohammad Tawakoli Targhi in Refashioning Iran, and he kind of throws it out there and then doesn't develop the idea specifically. So I found that useful here. And so he writes about. Homeless texts that fall between the cracks of nationalism that can't be, are not useful for secular Indian nationalism or for Iranian nationalism. And I really, I didn't talk about it here, but one of the arguments I make is that, well, they do find a home in Urdu. Those specific texts are still read, commented on, but in Urdu, and they're actually very central for Indian Muslim intellectual production, going forward. So that's how I see Urdu as continuing and extending the Persianate tradition. And it's, the same texts are being read, commented on, but in another language. But to the main part of your question, I think there is this kind of this fundamentally, or can be fundamentally, nostalgic approach, right, to the past and to being attentive to what is lost. And so I think that is part of, maybe that's where methodologically I'm aligned with Mana in trying to look at what are the contingent possibilities that were unrealized in modernity, that were latent in the sort of Persianate arrangement. But I think it's because the Persianate is not discarded to make room for modernity. It's actually the material that is reworked in the making of modern and national cultures. It's fundamentally generative for modernity. And that's why I see this possibility of reconciling those two, to think about something like a Persianate modernity, a modern, even national culture that is fundamentally built from taking these same parts and putting them together in a different way, which as I started the talk with, again, they're put together in different ways under, say, the Samanids than they are by the time we get to the Mughals. So to me, it's not too much of a conceptual leap to say, okay, these 20th century national states that are erected, take those same materials and arrange them differently. But that's not radically different from what earlier kind of empires are doing. Thanks for the great question.
Thank you so much for your talk. I find it really interesting that there's sort of different sites of how standardization happens, especially with the script example. And so often you hear like modern Hindi speakers talk about Devanagari being this like scientific script as well, but Urdu obviously has a much different relationship with its script. But I'm wondering, in sort of the codification and standardization in these parallel histories between Urdu and Persian, in the Urdu, you see a real keen interest in like the gendered aspects of the language and sort of this like removal of like the women's Urdu as this more like vulgar subculture. And I was wondering if there's a similar or comparable example in the Persian case where it starts to emerge as part of Iranian nationalism that's beyond just the script standardization, for example, if there's something else that has to do with like the purity of language or the standardification of language that you view as interesting or significant.
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting. It's not, of course, Afsan and Najmabadi has written more extensively on this. It's not something that I took up as directly women's language, for example, what you're thinking of, the kind of like Begmati Zaban in Urdu. What's interesting, there's not a direct equivalent, to my knowledge, of that phenomenon in Persian. And so instead, if that becomes something that has to be excised from the canon of Urdu literature to make it properly modern and compatible with modernity, instead, I think the equivalent is the male homoerotic tradition in Persian that has to be kind of sterilized and cleansed and removed from the canon and therefore from the body politic. So it's a much more, and this is getting into Najmabadi's argument, that is actually the starting point that then creates a public sphere in which women can participate. And so I think, just to connect this to Divya's question earlier then, this is, what I hope comes across is not, my orientation in this project is not just about recovering these pre-modern possibilities, but I don't want to be fundamentally anti-modern. It is exactly this point, for example. It's modernity that brings women into the public sphere or creates a public sphere in which women can participate. I think that's a good thing. I'm happy with that, even if there are also unfortunately things that are lost in that process.
I'll try to be very short. So Thank you very much for this very enlightening talk. I wondered what would happen if we move away from literary history to other forms of textuality, medicine, philosophy, scientific textuality. Would we see a very similar historical trajectory?
It would be a great project to answer. It's not the one that I did, so I can't speak to it as directly. But to some degree, or to the degree that I know, yes, in some domains, because these different spheres. I mean, what counts as literary and what is called literary? I mean, that's also a sort of modern designation, like the emergence and development of disciplines, right? And so there's not clean demarcation between what is philosophical and what is strictly poetry or whatever. So many of these works that get to be read as national or communal kind of heritage, treat science, medicine, philosophy, and so on. But it's interesting that they're kind of made, some of them are kind of made literary in order to then fit them into literary histories, which are to be national histories, at least in Iran. So to give an example, somebody like Ibn Sina wrote a little bit of poetry, but that's not really what he's primarily known for. But he gets written into these as a literary figure, gets written into the literary histories, and it's a way then of laying claim to him as a national figure. And there's other equivalents of other kind of more scientific or mathematically oriented figures that are similarly kind of appropriated here.
Okay. Thank you so much for your talk. Just one particular aspect, if you could clarify. I'm not sure. I maybe didn't understand fully, but you talked about how Iranian nationalism could align itself with Indo-European philology, whereas Urdu speakers weren't able to because the British essentially kind of enforced this perception that Urdu is a direct descendant from, or in the lineage of Sanskrit. So it's so in that way, and not. But then didn't European Orientalists still associate Sanskrit with Indo-European philology? And then if it is associated with Sanskrit distinctly, then does that not contradict its hybridity and mixture of different languages? If you could just clarify that.
Sure, and maybe I misspoke there, but it's that Urdu is not seen as the inheritor of Sanskrit, that Hindi takes that place. And so it's specifically because there's this idea that Urdu is connected to Persian and Arabic, and that those are what make Urdu, and that Hindi is properly this sort of descendant of Sanskrit, that then that kind of model of historical linguistics as kind of communal or national identity is available to Indian Hindus, but not to Muslims.